In today's personal finance story, I'm going to tell you about a man we'll call Mark. And this man is experiencing something that hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Californians are experiencing: frustration with the already unbearable living costs, gas costs, housing costs, taxes, and insurance costs, both home and auto. Now, for Mark, the final straw for him was his most recent yearly insurance bill. And when we go over how much he's actually paying, I think you'll be shocked. But in order to get to Mark's final straw, we also need to go over all the increased expenses he's experienced that, when combined together, has made him and thousands of others officially leave California. So let's get started with Mark's story. Mark was born and raised to a middle-class family in California. Mark attended his local state university in the CSU system, and Mark eventually graduated with a bachelor's and quickly landed a job as a web developer. That was close to 15 years ago, as Mark is now in his late 30s. And for the last 10 of those 15 years, Mark has made at least $100,000 per year. Now, by all accounts, that's excellent money. He knows and acknowledges this. In fact, making $100,000 a year was his dream goal when he first graduated college. But Mark lives in California, about 45 minutes outside of Los Angeles. And California has always been one of the most expensive states to live in. With that said though, for Mark, $100,000 has always been more than enough. He was able to buy a home when he was 34, he owns his Honda Civic outright, and he's always been able to have enough to live a decent middle-class life. That is, until recently. You see, as the years ticked by, ever since he graduated 15 years ago, he's noticed that each and every single year, his total living expenses creeped closer and closer to his salary. Now, it wasn't very quick or alarming, but it was noticeable. Each year, he saved slightly less, and that's even with small but steady salary increases. And at first, he thought this was just lifestyle creep. And for the first couple years, it probably was. But as he got accustomed to having a career, his expenses honestly leveled off. Same amount of eating out, purchases for his home, and entertainment, and in some years for those things, even less than the previous year. Yet, every year, regardless, he saved a little less and a little less. And honestly, this is a phenomenon that not just California, but most of America is feeling. For Mark, though, he noticed it in areas where California has just become insanely expensive when compared to other states: gasoline, utilities, and housing costs. So let's talk about these things, starting with gasoline. Gas in California is by far the most expensive out of any state in the country. It outpaces the US average by almost always at least $1, and that's precisely because of things implemented by California legislation. The state has its own gasoline blend. It also has extremely high taxes on gasoline, and it has a cap and trade program, basically a program to help reduce greenhouse gases, which in the grand scheme of things maybe can be argued as good or bad. But for Mark and the other individuals living in the state, it means one thing: higher gas prices. Mark says he spends on average $2,500 per year on fuel for his vehicle. And that's as someone who works from home. In fact, the average Californian spends even more, at a little over $3,100 per year. And feel free to let me know in the comments if you spend even more than that. Now, both of those numbers are still much higher than the US average, which comes in at $2,148. And remember, the US average is including California, which of course is making that national average much higher than it would be without California. Okay, what about utilities? Well, Mark says that he specifically bought a home a few years ago to build equity and to lock in a fixed mortgage payment instead of being at the mercy of his landlord. But one area that has gotten much more expensive, not less, for Mark is utilities. Mark's electric bill averages a whopping $375 per month, significantly higher than the national average. And I'm sure some of you watching right now have even higher electric bills, especially if you live in California. Why? Well, of course, because California has one of the highest per kilowatt costs in the entire nation. On average, 30.44 cents per kilowatt. The national average, 16.1 cents. So California is basically double. Interesting, in one of the most sunny states, which means one of the states with the highest ability to generate solar power. Okay, now let's talk about housing costs, which of course insurance is part of. For Mark, this put the final nail in the coffin and set his decision in stone to leave California permanently. Mark says that he was convinced to buy a home by his family, his coworkers, and ultimately himself. The draw of building net worth through equity simply by owning where you live appealed to him greatly. And when compared to renting in California, which has the second highest rent cost in the country at $2,800 on average per month, the decision seemed like a no-brainer, especially 4 years ago when Mark bought. And yes, he had to put a hefty down payment of $40,000, but his mortgage ended up being roughly the same of what he was paying for rent, $2,700 per month. But here's the thing for Mark. That's before utilities, before maintenance, and that was before the crazy insurance increases that the state has experienced. Not only that, Mark used to rent in LA, but in order to afford to buy his home, he moved 45 minutes outside the city, which means more driving and more fuel costs. Although luckily for him, he does work from home. The point is, Mark says he absolutely spends more per month now as a homeowner than he did as a renter. And he says those costs have increased every single year he's been an adult, and especially every single year he's been a homeowner. And then the final nail in the coffin happened. Home and auto insurance increases. California has been going through a massive insurance crisis. Insurance providers in some cases are just not renewing policies. They're also designating more areas high fire risk. And they're increasing the premiums for those that they are insuring, both on the home insurance and the auto insurance side. And on top of that, of course, they're doing everything they can to avoid paying out when required. Why? Well, it comes down to overall risk, wildfire risk, auto accident risk, and I'm sure just simply greed. Insurance companies have been absolutely wrecked, at least in California, over the last few years when it comes to wildfires in the state, which have caused billions of dollars in damages to insured properties. And on top of that, fire risk in California is only going up. Way up. Which means for people like Mark, who just so happens to live in a designated high fire risk zone, even though he says there's never been a fire in his neighborhood ever, home insurance has gone up thousands in just the last few years. Mark says his current bundled insurance plan, which includes his house, his Honda Civic, and his wife's Mazda CX-5, costs him $7,800 every single year, which is odd because, believe it or not, California is actually one of the cheapest states when it comes to home insurance. But didn't I just say there's an insurance crisis? Didn't I just say that Mark is about to leave the state precisely because of the cost of his home insurance? Yes, I did. And that's because that entire equation changes if your home happens to be in a high fire risk area, which Mark's happens to be. In that case, your home insurance will be significantly more expensive than the average. And that is if your insurance provider decides not to drop you entirely, which is a huge fear of Mark's and a valid one. Insurance companies are dropping users left and right. State Farm, for example, has issued non-renewal letters to over 70,000 homes in California. Allstate is also not renewing some of its policies. And that's just two on a very long list of insurance providers who are dropping policies. And if that happens to you or me or Mark, then you basically have one option for fire protection: the California FAIR Plan, which is a state-sponsored program for those who cannot find regular insurance. And spoiler alert, you need additional coverage with those California FAIR plans for non-fire related insurance. And those plans have also experienced increases. Most recently, 15.7% last year, with more undoubtedly to come. All in all, living costs in California have become unbearable for many, including Mark. And he says his most recent insurance premiums were his last straw. He says he really simply cannot afford to live here anymore. And he says even if he could, he's had enough with the state. And he says that he feels very lucky that he works entirely from home, allowing him the flexibility to leave the state in the first place. The problem, he says, is that a lot of high-paying jobs are in California, and they're near expensive metropolitan areas. But at the same time, the living expenses in those areas are usually insane. So those that don't work from home are really stuck between a rock and a hard place. Either stay in California with a high salary, but also with very high living costs, or leave California for a potentially lower salary in the chase of lower living expenses. Mark says his $100,000 plus salary should feel very comfortable. But in California, it feels like scraps.